Okay, and welcome to Volume 5 of the Bro Staff Bass class. This volume is going to be a little more generic. It's not really going to cover a particular technique or a piece of cover. It's wintertime now here in Charlotte, and we're starting to feel the chill of fishing getting tougher, and a lot of our options are weighing down, and there's only a few ways to catch fish that are, still as fun as top water and moving baits and things like that in the spring, summer, and fall. So this was a good time to talk about seasonal expectations for our region. And if you're watching this and you're not in our region, this is our region. We are in south central North Carolina, right on the border of South Carolina, right there in the Catawba River Basin. But a lot of us also fish in the Broad, Yadkin PD, French Broad, and the New River basins as well. So kind of in that general area, but most of these expectations will work for the state of North Carolina depending on how you're going to fish and what you're going to fish for. So we're going to get started. Basically, what I want to try to do, if we're going to break this down into a study, is to separate the months out based on the water temperature into the four seasons and kind of what you can expect from the fish, from the fishing, and from the day itself when you're out there fishing, based on what month you're in our region. So that's kind of how we're going to do this, and we're going to try to keep it as simple as possible, starting with water temperatures. So this is typical for our Piedmont, North Carolina region. This can be, shaken one way or the other based on a really warm February, for example, or a super cold October, for example, or November. So there's some give and take with these, but for the most part, in our region, on a lake that's not artificially heated, because we have a lot of those as well, which change the water temperature based on power plants and things like that. But typically, if you're in a reservoir that doesn't have an artificial heat source, these are the temperatures you can go ahead and expect to see when you go out there through each month. Like I said, some give and take with all these, but if you talk to me in general about water temperatures, I can kind of figure out what month you might be in if you tell me you're in North Carolina. So why is that important? Why are these different months important to keep in mind when we go fishing? And some people it ain't. Some people fish the same way all year long, which is fine. But if you're really trying to break down and figure out what your expectations are, which is what this class is for, you really need to think about what these fish are doing these times of year, which is, the whole reason we're out there. We try to figure them out. So I broke it down like this month by month, and this is just my opinion from what I've seen fishing in this area for 15, 20 years. And we never stop fishing, fortunately. We're in a part of the country where we don't ever have to stop fishing due to ice out or seasons and such like that. So we're kind of fortunate that we can see all 12 months on the water, and most of the time on the same body of water. So in January, starting out, most of these bass are still staying out deep. They're roaming around. Typically, they're looking for those shad to feed on. Now, again, most of these things can also have exceptions to them, like there could be a big old fat largemouth in your pond who still eat a bluegill imitator, or you can go to a real sunny riprap bank in January and find them eating crawfish in 4 feet of water. So all these things can kind of be bucked, but in general, in January, those fish are still out deep. February, depending on how warm or cold February lays up for us, they are basically getting ready to lay up into pre-spawn. They're packing on weight, they're packing on eggs, and they're going to have to start feeding a little bit more. If February gets a little bit warm, it'll encompass the March block there, which is where they're getting ready for the spawn. They're pre-spawn full bore, and they're setting up on secondary points, secondary banks where they can lay up in the back of a cove easily afterwards and start looking for beds to make. So March and February can kind of be melded together depending on how warm or cold February is. In April, it's wide open. The males are setting up the beds or already have, and the females are feeding up or already laying up in the beds, either getting courted or actually going through the act of spawning. April is typically when you catch your biggest fish of the year, in my opinion, because as I've said before, every adult bass that wants to procreate and pass their genetics on has to come shallow. And shallow is dependent on the clarity of your water and the cover for them to bed on. Clear lakes, shallow is 10 feet. Clear, real dirty lakes, shallow could be a foot and a half. So April is when around here the largemouth and smallmouth, and spotted bass roll up there to start making beds and spawn. In May, again, depending on how cool or warm May is, more often than not, the spawn is about done. At least by mid-May, the spawn is pretty much finished, and the males are now guarding the fry, while the females roll out a little bit and rest from the act of carrying eggs and the actual physical act of spawning, which is pretty violent when they actually do it. She gets beat up pretty good. So that's a good time to still fish shallow, but if May gets a whole lot warmer and you get into those 90-degree days, those fish could already be doing June behaviors, which is where the males are probably done guarding the fry because the spawning was probably a little bit earlier and finished earlier, and now the brim, the bluegill, the sunfish are starting to move up, and you can pretty much go to those beds and see if they're active and look and see if the bass are really keying in on those things. Some of the fish may have already moved out a little bit offshore, but for the most part, the fish are pretty much still shallow in May. And in, June can go either way depending on temperature, but you can already start figuring those fish are completely done spawning. The fry are probably about done being guarded by daddy, and now the brim are moving up and they're getting ready to make their beds, or they already have. So again, the bass are looking to move out, but they'll stay up to feed on brim. July, typically around here, we are hot, dog days of summer. Can't even hardly, fish past 10, 11 o'clock. It's so hot. The brim are still a key there. If you know of a good brim bed, especially laid up in the shallow somewhere, you could still try to see if those bass are picking them off. But more often than not, these fish are now pulled way out shallow in the out deep, in the thermocline, getting out of that hot 90-degree surface water and laid up in that 65 to 70-degree water, 15, 20 feet down. And they're running shad. August is pretty similar as well. Same kind of deal. Those fish could be up shallow early in the morning, late in the evening to go ahead and take advantage of that low light and feed up on bluegill, on whatever else is up there. At this point in time, you could also have morning shad schools and, on wide open places, off points, off main channel intersections, stuff like that. But we're going to talk about that a little bit more in depth later. But the bass are now out deep, really angry at the temperature. You can catch them at night when they're more relaxed, more comfortable. That sun's not beating down on them. But the water is super duper hot in August around here, and the fish know it, and they're real angry about it. But the better fishermen are going to push up shallow first thing in the morning and see if it's even feasible, and then probably lay out deep offshore, try to find those schools of fish instead of one here, one there. And you can have a good day in a hurry if you get on the right point and those fish are out there deep and feeding on shad. So September. Basically, if we, again, have a cooler September and those water temperatures start dropping into the 70s and high 60s, those shad are going to start pushing back into the creeks, and that's where the bass are going to start running. Subsequently, if it's a hotter September, they could still be way offshore and feeding on brim early in the morning. The brim will probably spawn a couple different times, but we're going to talk about that again in depth here in a minute. But the bass could still be up shallow early in the morning, late in the evening, but they're probably still going to be deep. Unless it's cooler and we slide into October kind of thing, where all the shad are running into the creeks. They're trying to get in that oxygenated water. Typically at this time you have fall turnover, so the oxygen-rich water at the bottom is now mixing in with the cooler water that's falling from the cooling air temperatures. So the fish can move around a lot more. They're not limited to a particular depth of the column where the oxygen is good and everywhere else it's bad. So October can be kind of a mixed bag of where the fish are going to be. They should be eating everywhere, feeding up for not only the opportunistic situation of shad being all over the place at this point in time, but also because, the water temperature is great everywhere for them to move around. Again, November as well, depending on how warm or cold it is, typically follow the shad. They're still going to be in their fall patterns, early winter patterns, feeding on shad and crawfish. Follow the bait, you'll find the fish. In December, around here, we start getting into our mid 50s to low 50-degree water temperatures. Some places even high 40s, depending on how cold we get. And then you get back into your January type patterns where these fish are offshore. They're looking for shad. Typically, they're in that 15, 20, 30-foot range. There could be some on some warm banks up early in the morning being opportunistic of bait fish or crawfish up there. More often than not, they're going to be where the shad are. They're going to be offshore. And that brings us to the shad. It's going to be real similar to what we just talked about with the bass, because the bass follow these guys a lot, except for the bluegill thing doesn't come into play here. So January and February, those shad are way out deep, suspended in creek channels, river channels, things like that, moving around, trying to stay comfortable. They don't want to die, so they don't want to be on that real cold surface water temperature. They're going to be where the oxygen is, where the plankton is, and where the cool temperatures are. So, not too hot, not too cold. They're going to come on the surface to feed, move around, try to run away from schools of bass, but more often than not, they're going to be suspended, 10, 15 feet deep, where they can eat, feed, not have to worry about bass all the time, not being exposed to birds, stuff like that. As it warms up, through March and April, they're going to start moving up shallow to feed on, productivity, algae, and things like that start growing around up in the shallow water. And then by May, they're getting ready to spawn. They're coming up there to spawn on riprap and docks at first thing in the morning. And when that happens, you can get right in a hurry by mimicking them, where those bass are up there gorging that spawn and more, because it's, hundreds of thousands of them in one group laying on riprap and on the docks, just doing their thing, and the bass know it, and they're vulnerable at that time. So the bass will kind of gang up in wolf packs and go gorge, and that's where fish and shad imitators in May, first thing in the morning, dark 30, can be really key into putting a lot of fish in the boat. In June and July, they're done spawning, and the tiny little bitty shad that have hatched from the spawn are all over the place. We call them peanut shad. You'll look at them in the creeks. You'll start seeing them in the summertime when they come up to the water surface, and when you do see the bass up there feeding on them, you'll see them knock them out, in the midair on top water, and they're little bitty things. They're about an inch long, and it's pretty hard to mimic them unless you get real good at throwing small tackle, but those little bitty shad are all over the place, and that's why you don't have shad-filled lakes, because most of these ain't gonna make it after spawning. So in July, the big gizzards are up in the grass. They're feeding on the algae on the grass and hiding up there. They like being up air protected, and the thread fins are all over the surface at dawn and dusk. So this is where you see first thing in the morning schools of shad everywhere, and then late in the evening, right when the sun's done dropped down, you'll see them come up too. Same kind of thing in August. In September and October, November, when we start cooling off, they will push up into the creeks, go into that oxygen-rich, cooler water where all the nutrients are. The bass will follow them, but then as it gets real cold, they're going to push right back out again and get suspended out there in that comfortable water temperature. So the common theme here, if you ain't picked up on it yet, is your water temperature has to be comfortable for oxygen, for actual non-kill-off temperature for shad, which shad below 40 degrees will die off. I think the magic number is probably somewhere around 42, 43 solid, where they will start dying off if the column is that cold. They can't handle it. They're very fragile fish. So they're going to go find a blanket of insulated water somewhere where they can feed, have oxygen, and not be too cold or too hot. And when you find that magic number, and you can see it on your depth finder, you can replicate it pretty much anywhere in the lake you want, as long as the lake's pretty stable. So water temperature really drives the shad. Sunfish. So we've talked about the bass, we've talked about one major forage, and now this is the other major forage. And for people that don't fish shallow very much, thinking about a sunfish and why it is where it is and when it is not super important to a bass fisherman. But to me it is. I enjoy fishing bluegill, imitators up shallow. I enjoy catching them, on the side, especially in the summertime. I have a ball just going out and fishing for them as well. So I try to keep an eyeball on them all year long to figure out what their behaviors are doing. And that'll kind of key me in on what the bass could possibly do with them at the same time. So same kind of deal in January and February. They're out suspended in that comfortable water temperature. These guys don't want to be too cold either. They're warm water fish. They don't really care about being cold. They bleach out when they get real cold and deep. They don't feed very much. They're not aggressive. So they like being warm just like most sunfish do. And in summertime or in wintertime, they're going to pull out and try to find that blanket of insulated water where they can feed here and there and be comfortable until it's time to move back up. So yeah, in March and April, when your water temperatures do come back up, they're going to slide up there, and one of the first things they're going to be able to feed on is fish eggs. So when they know they can go, bombard one male bass or one male and female bass with 7 or 8 different bigger bluegill or redbreast sunfish, they gonna get to those bass eggs if they can, and then in May they're gonna pick off the fry. So basically, in the middle of May, somewhere middle to end of May, they're gonna start their spawn too. They've gone up there, they've fed up as much as they can. They usually lay back in cool temperatures, move up fast in warm temperatures. So if May gets real warm, they're gonna slide on up there immediately and start beginning their spawns, and that's when they start making all those little craters up there in communities, because they're community spawners, to where you'll come into one little bank, one little pocket, and you'll see 20 of these holes, and they got one big male bluegill up there, and that's the key to know that the bass could be up there getting ready to pick them off as well. In June, July, August, these fish are wide open. It's the hottest months of the year. They're most excited and energetic of the year. They're up feeding. There's lots of bugs. There's lots of stuff like mayflies are hatching now. There's lots of worms and caterpillars falling into the lake. Grasshoppers are real active now. So these guys are really loving life all around the banks, around overhanging tree limbs, logs. They like docks, boat ramps, everything. They'll be all over. If you want to catch brim and you want to try to pattern brim, you can pretty much do it from June through August without a problem at all. They will spawn at least twice if they can, based on full moon and water temp. So you will get an early spawn if that water temperature gets up in the 60s, 70s pretty quick in April and gets real good and stable in May, and you have a nice fat full moon there. They will lay up and spawn, and then they'll go away. They'll abandon their beds, and then if conditions are strong enough, they'll come back in July or August and do it again. So trying to figure out when these brim are on the banks will help you dictate, if you like throwing bluegill imitators, what you should be doing. When the fall comes, they're active during the warm parts of the day. They're completely inactive in the colder weather, because that's when they pull off. Their metabolism is slowing down. And as it gets colder, here we are laying right back into December and January and February, into their real deep suspension time where they're not up shallow at all and they're out deep trying to find that comfortable water. Again, water temp, food, and oxygen. 3 key things to think about when you're trying to predict where a fish is going to be in its behavior through the seasons. So just me, this is just me, and this is spring, what I'm going to be doing. So this is Mountain Island Lake. If you don't know where it is, it's in Charlotte. This is where Charlotte's drinking water comes from, and it's just a lake I use to break down, things like this every time I have a class, because it's the first one that comes to mind for me. In springtime, I'm probably going to be fishing in 10 feet or less. There's really not a reason to fish any deeper than that, because the biggest fish of the lake are going to be in the shallowest part of the water. So looking at a map like this, if you get on Navionics web app online, which I highly recommend, again, if you haven't heard any of my classes before, get on a browser on your computer or your phone or whatever and look up Navionics web app, and you can pretty much scroll to any lake in the country and look at the contours. So this map is showing you a couple main coves off the main channel there that are long, that have a good contour line through the middle of them, but shallow banks in the back. You see that fat single color of blue around the edge. That is one singular depth, and if I'm correct, I think it's about to 5 feet. So you've got a lot of that thick blue line around the edge of this in the back of these pockets, which are excellent place for these fish to bed. I'm also going to be using baits that are suited for the banks. I'm not going to be using something like a Carolina rig or a spoon or a deep diving crankbait or anything like that. I'm going to hone my arsenal in to be baits that can be fished in 5 to 10 feet of water or less, and that are not going to be inhibited by structure and shallow cover and things like that. So, really think about covering the column, when you go out at any times. Well, if you're really going to cover bedfish, you only need to cover one tiny part of the column, and that's the shallowest part. I'm also going to be keeping my eyes open for beds, and they could be anywhere. They could be made that morning. They could have been made a week ago and be abandoned, but I'm going to look for them, and that's going to teach me some stuff about what the fish are doing. If you can see down in the bottom of the water, start looking around cover like dock posts, stumps, lay down trees. They like having some cover around them when they make their bed. So a lot of times they will be out in the middle of the open, and that's because of competition. They're going to bed wherever they can to get the best sunlight to warm their eggs and that they can protect. But keeping your eyes open for beds will kind of let you know what those fish may or may not be doing while you're there. And then water clarity will dictate how shallow you fish. Like I said before, in a lake like Lake Norman, which is extremely clear at the lower end, you can see down 7-8 feet. So a bass could be spawning in 7-8 feet. Whereas in a lake like Wiley or High Rock or something like that, where it's a lot more stained, those fish could be sitting in 8 inches of water because they need to get that sunlight to warm those eggs at night, or to keep them warm, to keep them over for night, because the fish really can't warm up those eggs and keep them warm throughout the night. They count on that sunlight to do that, to let those little guys grow. So anyway, that's kind of what I'm looking at when I'm talking about springtime as far as map study, and then what my plan is there written in the bullets. For my heavy hitters for spring, and this is just me again, this is my opinion, this is what I've experienced over the last 15 years, is I still want to cover that column with good high potential baits. So top water, everybody's favorite in springtime, for me anyway, but I want to cover it with baits that are going to mimic sunfish, baits that might mimic small brim, small shad, things like that. So these are my favorite baits for springtime, and that's a popar on the top left, that's a spro popping bronze-eye frog, that's a live target hollow-bellied sunfish, and just a buzz bait clacking. If you want to cover more water and try to attract an aggressive bite, you don't need to know where the beds are. You just want to, try to, hit the nail on the head by blind casting with a buzz bait. Throw something like this one with a little bit more sunfish pattern. But that live target sunfish there, keep that in mind. That is my gold star. In the middle of the column, this is where your square-billed crankbaits are going to come into play, your loud whopping spinner baits that are going to be able to be fished slow in a little bit more murky water and pull that fish to it, and then your wacky rig Senko for fishing around docks and cover in a little bit more clear water where you're trying to draw that big fish out for an easy meal. Square-billed crankbait, though, probably the number one there in the mid column for me. And for the heavy hitters on the bottom, these are three that I've had a lot of success with. Obviously, a skirted jig, a flipping jig with a crawl on it. It's probably number one for sure. But for clearer lakes, you can go with a Magnum shaky head. That's a shaky head with a big trick worm on it. Or the Texas rig brush hog's always been super popular around here for a lighter rig for flipping that still has a bulky profile. So it's going to fall slower, but it's a bulky profile, easy meal. Springtime bass love that. So again, top three for me. Top water would be that live target hollow-bellied sunfish. Middle of the column would be that square-bill crankbait. That's a KVD 1.5. And the bottom would probably be the skirted jig with the Pit Boss trailer on it. That's going to be my number one for the bottom. And a special case for springtime is you can go fish moving water. These two fish came from a river system where we got there in February and the water had warmed. You can see I'm just in a long sleeve t-shirt there, and the next week it was a little colder in the morning, so Tim there on the bottom right is in a jacket with a boggin, but we were nice and comfortable the week before there on the top left, and those big fish are already moved up in pre-spawn. You see both those fish are real healthy and fat, and you can catch a lot of big fish in moving water in springtime if you slow down and fish the right areas. Those big fish aren't going to be out in that middle of the current right now. They're going to be trying to feed up and lay up for the spawn. So look at your pools. Look at your slower areas where you have a lot of room to really slow down and comb through the area. Both of these fish ate bottom baits that imitated crawfish. So again, from about the months of February through April, if you're going to slow down and fish the bottom, I would recommend a crawfish because it has done us very well. But that's just another special case that you need to think about, especially if you have a kayak. Go find you a river that's not blown out from springtime rains and that has decent population of bass in it. You go find some slow moving pools with some depth. You're liable to be able to do some stuff like this. So in summertime, we're going to come out a little bit. So you can see we've moved out of these coves and now we're on these main channel banks. and points. So first thing in the morning, late in the evening, I'm still fishing topwater, guys. I'm gonna fish topwater as long as I can. I enjoy that type of fishing, and it don't last all year long. So I'm gonna be first thing in the morning in summertime, and last, the very last thing I do before it gets dark, I'm gonna be throwing topwater. The sunfish have now become a more sought after forage. They're going to be in the coves. They're going to be in the main channel coves. They're going to be in the back of small coves. But the bass are going to run in there and feed on that. But then that's going to be real localized. The rest of the fish are going to be moved out, trying to find these shad that are in open waters. And that's why it says eyes are open for schoolers. So you keep your eyes and your ears puckered to see if you hear busting fish, and have a bait ready to throw on those fish. And number one is going to be a spoon for me all day, because of the distance you can cast it and how easy it is to fish and mimic a small shad those fish are probably feeding on. And there again, your depth finder can't hurt in that aspect. You could lay up in a lake where some of those little wolf packs of bass have already pulled off, gotten grouped up, and now they're out feeding in the main channel, and you would never know they were there if you didn't have a depth finder laying below you. So for my heavy hitters for summer, the popar, the frog, and the live target are going to stay there, as well as the buzzbait are for topwater. And we're going to introduce a new fella named the Whopper Plopper now. I know anybody who's reading this, listening to this, watching this, whatever, has thrown a Whopper Plopper at this point in time, but the thing just catches fish flat out. I fish it, but I don't fish it as much as I used to, because I have found that live target and I enjoy fishing it so much, that live target sunfish. But the Whopper Plopper catches fish, guys. It flat out does. In my opinion, just get a couple sizes and a couple colors. I don't think you need every size and every color. I think if you get a small one in two colors and a big one in two colors, you're about done. If I had to recommend one of them, I'd get the big one personally. But you got to build a rod and reel around it, and I ain't going into that right now. But if you ain't tried the Whopper Plopper, long about April and May, go ahead and grab you one, get it on a rod and throw it. Just wind it back to the boat and get ready. You're going to have some fun with it. Middle of the column, we're going to go to bluegill imitators. That's a live target bluegill square barrel crankbait. And then we get into my favorite, the fluke, weedless fluke, wacky fluke, whatever you want to do with it. I've nose hooked it, put it in the jig head, whatever. Fluke becomes a phenomenal bait, especially in clear water, however you want to fish it. I'm going to fish it weightless, jerk it, let it fall. And then that stupid weedless Senko, or that wacky Senko again. That thing, it just catches fish just about anywhere, just about all times of year, if you have the patience to let it fall on slack line around cover. It just flat catches them. So, probably my heavy hitter in that middle of the column is going to be that darn fluke, guys. That thing catches fish everywhere all year long if you have clear enough water. On the bottom, we introduced a little Ned rig here now. That little old thing came out a couple years ago. Has caught fish all over the country now. Spotted bass absolutely hate it. So if you can find some spotted bass, if you can find them on docks, you can find them on cover, and you can throw that little thing right there, you're going to get bit. Don't know what they think it is. Don't care what they think it is, but they eat that thing a lot. Again, we're also going to keep that bigger trick worm on the shaky head for a little bit bigger profile. And now we're going to introduce a Carolina rig. So if you're going to go offshore and chase those fish that are laying on those, primary and secondary points and gravel bars and rock piles, you can pull out the old ball and chain now and drag it around. However, my number one on the bottom is going to be that little Ned rig right there, because it is so universal and it catches all sizes. I've caught little bluegill on it, green sunfish on it, and I've caught 3.5, 4 pounders on it. So I like it. Learn to fish it. You'll enjoy it. Catch a lot of fish. A special case for summer moving water is small water. And I have started developing a love for creek fishing in Charlotte. I'm fortunate enough to have a job that allows me to get outside and get in the creeks a good bit. It's actually what I do for work. And the byproduct of that is I've figured out a lot of creeks that hold fish, and that are, you can tell by there in the middle and the side picture on the right, that you can kayak through and catch bass. That in the middle is about a 3.5, 4 pounder that I caught out of, 1.5 feet of water in a pool. So yeah, if you're going to fish moving water, look for your pools for your fatter, bigger fish. But it's water that's untapped, that nobody's fishing, that takes some effort to get to, some effort to get in and out of. But if you can find you a creek that you have legal access to, that you know holds bass, and it's deep enough to paddle in the middle of summer, I'm gonna go do it. And I have a good time doing it. And I'll show you a little video here of the first bass I ever caught in a kayak out of a urban creek.
Please don't hang up. Do you see the size of that bass?
Oh, it's a bass? I thought it was catfish.
No, it's a huge bass. I have zero backbone to land this fish. You just want to get tired.
The rod was way too small for this. Was not expecting it.
Don't jump. Stop jumping. Just come here.
Using a weightless Zoom tiny fluke nose hook.
Yeah.
Twitching it. They couldn't stand it. Caught a lot of bass that day. That was the biggest out of a creek. As you can tell, I was excited. So special case in summer with moving water in a moderate size is the old South Fork New River in western North Carolina. This one holds a special place in my heart. It is an absolutely gorgeous body of water up in the mountains of North Carolina, very close to West Jefferson and Ashe County. Oh man, it's got smallies in it, guys, and they're not huge. I mean, most of the smallmouth you'll catch will be between 10 and 14 inches. But, you'll have a rare day like that picture on the left where you'll catch a 19, picture in the middle where you catch a 16. They hit topwater all day because they're cold water fish that love summertime because it lets them get aggressive. And it's the most serene, beautiful fishing, that you'll get to experience within 2 hours of Charlotte. When we go up there, I have to be dragged back to my truck to leave because it is probably my favorite fishery body of water right now going, just with how I enjoy getting up there and getting back to my roots in nature. It gets me out of the city in the summertime, gets me off the lakes with all the boat traffic. It gets me up to some pretty clear water with smallmouth that'll hit top water. So just a little idea of what it looks like. I mean, just giant cliffs, beautiful forests, and water, just gin clear, beautiful water. And, we'll just make a day of it and float 6 or 7 miles and just fish top waters and small baits on the bottom and catch smallmouth and rock bass all day long. And if you haven't river fished yet and you're a kayak fisherman, you really need to think about it. Ask a couple buddies to go with you. Try to figure out a shuttle. We don't know what we're doing. We just figure it out as we go. And I mean, it's really worth it. Just make a little old plan and get up there and run afloat, because you'll run up in some untouched water that you wish you had known about, years before. And then, a special case of moving water. This is the Catawba below Lake Wiley. This is a large system. This is the Catawba River. And it's getting a little bit more pressure with people tubing in it and such. But we took a trip a few years ago where we put in below Lake Wiley and we floated 26 miles over the weekend. Packed everything into our kayaks, our food, our sleeping bags, our tents, and our tackle. And we took off and we went down the river and camped for 2 nights. It was about 5 of us. And it was in early May. It had already gotten pretty warm, but nights were nice and cool in the low 60s. And we had an absolute blast. And this is one picture from it. It's probably my favorite picture from it. You can see no homes, no people. This is probably, 15 miles in, maybe 12 miles in, and you're done with development, and you're done with people, and there's no boats. And I had this whole island all to myself, and I pulled up there to sit down and have a snack and rest, stretch my legs, and it's probably my favorite part of the whole trip, other than being with my guys. We caught fish. It was a good time of year to go. Fish were feeding, aggressive. Water was still decently cool, but it was warm enough to catch them on top. This is Stu here. He's catching them on a Rapala, floating original, actually. Just twitching it around. We went old school on us and had a blast, caught all kinds of different fish. But we, had some very interesting camps. This is our second night on a rock island, which we were glad we found because there was really nowhere else to camp that night on the river banks. And we had a great time. We pulled our kayaks up there, we ate, listened to some music, talked some fishing. We did a little bit of fishing from the bank. We had some shenanigans. Stu is a very big fan of fire and decided to try to light the rock on fire and was successful with that, and decided to get a jump picture in the fire. And I obliged and got this sweet shot of Stu in his element with the river in the background on what we had dubbed Hardcore Kayak Fishing Team Island, jumping over fire. So yeah, we had a phenomenal time. So recommend checking big rivers, little rivers, and medium-sized rivers out in summer. In the fall, we're basically going to be talking about creeks pretty much all day long. Now, the fish could bite just about anywhere, but if you're wanting to throw the bait and figure out where the shad are, they're going to be the dominant forage. They're going to be in the creek channels. So try to find the intersections between the main channel and the creeks, from one front part of the creek to the back part of the creek, intersections of two creeks coming together. Figure out where those shad are. You're probably going to find the bass. And again, they liable to school all day long. So keep your eyes ready. But pretty much these fish are starting to feed. That water temperature is between 60 and 70 right now. The fish are aggressive. They're still hitting top water. They're still biting crankbaits. They're still biting sunfish. They're doing everything. The fall is great. Almost as good as spring, but not quite there for catching fish on just about any way you want. Again, these are my number ones for the fall. Gone is the live target now. It works, but it don't work as good as that spook. Something about that Super Spook Junior that just draws strikes in. It has to have a place up there. Popar stays because it's a shad mimicker. Great, bait for slowing down top water in the morning. Buzzbait stays. You could change colors, go to a white, a silver flash, whatever. A Whopper Plopper absolutely stays. Excellent fall top water. If I had to pick a number one out of that, I'm sorry guys, it's going to have to be the Whopper Plopper personally. In mid-column, here's where we're starting to slide in with a little Shad Rap bite here. When that water starts cooling off, that Shad Rap number 7, Shad Rap number 5 become really prolific in being able to catch these fish because it's real subtle, it's real natural, it's real small. Square bill there, that KVD 1.5 right beside it is still prolific, still catch a bunch of fish, but the Shad Rap has made its presence known as soon as that water temperature starts dropping. So you can put that thing in your hand all day and just comb the bank and get bit. Fluke, though, still big, huge part of the column. That's going to be my number one for this group. The Keytech swim bait down there at the bottom, that's a Keytech fat, swing impact fat. Excellent little rig. Put it on a jig head, swimming around docks, swimming around cover. Mimics a little small shad. And then your Cinco, again, if they're on docks, if they're on cover and they're staying still hard to beat that in clear water. Number one, though, obviously for mid-column, if you had to pick one, for me, in clear water, it's going to be that Fluke. On the bottom, we brought our jig back. We're still going to fish that brush jig with the crawl trailer. We're going to stick with that big old worm again because the fish are still active. The Ned rig is still there, and then you can still flip a brush hog. So pretty much anything you want to fish on the bottom should get bit to a degree, but just kind of up and down size your baits based on the size of fish you're really trying to, pertain to in your lake. So in the winter, I'm going to look for open deep water fish, main channel fish, and then I'm going to look for rocks. So usually you want to fish from middle of the day to the end of the day instead of beginning of the day to the middle of the day, because those fish are going to get real active in the afternoon when that water temperature hits its peak, and that's when they're going to do their feeding, and then they're liable to be done. So usually an afternoon bite, and now crawfish are going to join shad as a key forage along the rocks. So this is where your crawfish crankbaits come in key, at least down to about 42, 45 degree water. After that, it gets tough for anything. So rocks next to deep water are key for me with that, especially, and then that main channel is the first priority for me, trying to look for those areas to fish on the main river channel itself. The creeks can still produce if they're big enough and stable enough, but if they're blowing out orange mud that's cold and the main channel is a little bit clear, a little bit warmer, I'm going to stay on the main channel. Depth finder, it is now imperative that those fish are absolutely not on the banks. You can take that depth finder out there, try to find some of these contour lines you can see here on Navionics web app. Follow those contour lines where they come together and see if you can figure out a place where those bass are suspending. Then pull your spoon or your drop shot out and catch them. But depth finder in winter is critical. So in winter, there is a topwater situation if they school. Most of this is keyed in on artificially heated lakes like Lake Norman, like Lake Wiley. They have steam and nuclear plants on them that cause artificially hot water temperatures. So the fish will actually school because the shad are going to go to those warmer water temperatures and make sure they survive the cool down in the wintertime. So keep a spook ready for that, but keep some spoons rigged up, guys. The spoons are really a universal fish catching machine in the winter, and you can see here they're in every single part of the column for me in winter. The mid column really didn't change except we threw a jerk bait in there where you twitch, and pause it for 5 seconds or as long as you can stand it. For some odd reason, in the wintertime, they really key on that dying shad bait as opposed to any other time of the year. And that could be because they're used to shad die-offs and they're looking for that particular weak shad. So jerkbait, probably, if the spoon won't on here, would be number 1 for my wintertime mid-column. But that spoon, for me, I try to always keep it rigged up. Jerkbait's close, though. Jerkbait's like a 1A. And on the bottom over here, we got our jig, we got our big worm. Now we've added a drop shot and a spoon over here. Drop shot usually for those vertical fish or suspended over cover, suspended over bait fish. You can drop a worm or a little old shad looking bait right on top of the fish and wiggle it. Again, depth finder is key, but the spoon, again, excellent bait to catch whatever's out there, including nice sized bass. So probably for that one, I'm going to stick with the spoon again for the bottom. I love spoons in the winter, if you couldn't tell. So this is going to pertain more to my Charlotte folks or my Charlotte area folks. This is, if you were asking me where we going, it's kind of a little system I developed to give you the variables that complete the equation that tell me where I'm going each month. So for January, the lakes are cold, full, and clear because of all the wet weather. The rivers are too cold to fool with yet. It's coming up soon. The water's in the 40s and the fishing window is small, middle of the day. Spotted bass are more active than largemouth in cold water, and all that equals I'm going to lower Lake Norman because it's artificially warmer and it's very clear and it's full of spots. So spots are going to be more active than largemouth this time of year, so I'm going to go catch something. I'm going to throw small swim baits. I'm going to keep a spoon ready. I'm going to have a Ned rig on hand, a small jig, and a sinking fluke. Either a jig head in it or a nose hook to fish open water, you know, around schooling fish or up around the banks if I see fish moving around. But Lower Norman is going to be where I go in February for those reasons. So here on the map you see that, you know, Lower Norman is huge and pretty much everything from you know, from that big white main channel there left of the picture to the east or to the right is all warmed by one water treatment or one nuclear plant there at the bottom of the picture. You can see his little discharge canal there, that solid fat blue color. That's spitting out really warm water all year long, and it really becomes key in fall and winter. So that whole end of the lake is artificially 10-15 degrees warmer than it should be, which helps them stay active in the wintertime. February, some years this is when your pre-spawn could be happening late in the month, or it may not, depending on if it's still cold, if it's starting to warm up. It's really not warm enough for anything to spawn yet, but next month everything's going to be in gear. So right now I know my numbers in February are going to be down, but I'm going to look for quality over quantity. So this is when I'm going to go to the Catawba below Wiley. And I'm going to throw that Texas rig crawl. I'm going to try a fat swim bait. I'm going to beat around a square bill, keep a jig ready, and even a spinner bait too if I want to slow down a little bit. So the Catawba below Wiley. So talking about the Catawba River below Wiley, it's basically a system of the Catawba River that hasn't been dammed up for a long ways. They've left it open channeled, and a lot of kayak fishermen, a lot of airboat fishermen know about it, jet boat fishermen, stuff like that. Um, it just holds quality fish. If you know how to navigate it, if you're safe about navigating below a dam in a river, you need to give it a shot. It's a great place to fish. It's kind of different, but it's still close to Charlotte, so you can kind of fish away from the city while you're in the city, kind of thing. So definitely want to think about a spot like that in February when the numbers are down, but you're looking for quality and you're just trying to look at something different. So in March, we're probably looking at full-blown pre-spawn right now here, and the fish are probably on their way up. They're probably not really looking to move out anymore, and they could be on main channel points, main channel banks, secondary points, moving back. So we're going to try to catch them on their way in. The spring rains could have some color in the water, and you're going to get a little bit more productivity from the water temperature going up with the algae and phytoplankton, things like that. And pretty much every big female bass is full of eggs and ready to move up to get this spawn going. So power fishing has now just kicked into gear with the rising water temps. I'm going to go to Lake Wiley. Things that I'm going to look to throw and have rigged up are like a Cinco or Ned rig around some docks. Obviously a square bill crankbait again, spinner bait, rolling around wood cover, and then a jig to pitch to everything I can see. We're going to be looking for those fish that are getting ready to move up and feed. I enjoy fishing Lake Wiley this time of the year. She's got a lot of different creeks and coves in her, very riverine shaped lake. A lot of opportunities to find stained or dirty water. A lot of opportunities to find a creek or a big cove you like. Good pre-spawn lake. A lot of different stuff to fish from top to bottom. In April, it's on. It's just go fishing in April wherever you want. They're biting everywhere, so go have fun. This is the month to catch giants. All the bass around are shallow thanks to the spawn, and the water is warm enough now for pretty much whatever you want to throw. So I'm gonna go have some fun. I'm gonna go to Lake Baden. I'm gonna throw a frog, any kind of bluegill imitator you want up shallow, a square bill around riprap and rocks and things like that. Have a jig to pitch into anything, a Cinco to skip around docks, a spinner bait up around bushes and stumps. Pretty much you name it. You can take anything you want that's going to fish that 10-foot range and shallower and possibly get bit. But think about maximizing your size right here, because the biggest fish in the lake are up shallow now. So you don't really have to go small in April typically to get bit. And so Baden is on the Yadkin chain out around Albemarle, North Carolina, and it's got a lot of different stuff to fish. It's got the Yadkin River there coming in on the western shore there, the left side of that image, and then it's got a lot of backwater on the right side where there's a lot of topography over there in that river basin. So all that valley of creeks there on the east shore, when they dammed the lake, got filled full of water too, but they're not really on the beaten path of the river, so it stays a little bit clear, a little bit greener. There's a lot of grass in Baden. There's a lot of docks in Baden, and there's a good amount of riprap and rocks too. Baden's pretty much a complete lake. Great lake to fish in April though. In May, bass are still shallow. Remember, they're feeding and they're garden fry. The temperatures are now perfect for top water. They're nice and warm. If it's real hot again, the bass are already starting to school. But remember, now pleasure cruisers are becoming a thing. There are people out there skiing. There are people out there riding jet skis and pontoon boats around now. So we have to think about that for a comfortable, good day on the water. And remember, this is where we going. If you going with me, I'm going to go to Tuckertown. A lot of natural cover there, a lot of big fish that live up in natural cover, so I'm going to fish natural cover things: frog, spinnerbait, floating lizard, a nice swim bait, any kind of bluegill imitators you can throw up shallow or throw out a little bit deeper, and then schooling bait just in case, like a spoon or a little swim bait or something like that. But Tuckertown is an extremely riverine lake. It's pretty small. It's got two major creeks that feed it. One on the eastern side, one on the western side, and as you can see what I've highlighted right there, lily pads are all in the back of that creek. That's where I'm going to go to enjoy fishing a frog and lily pads in North Carolina, because we don't get that opportunity very much. So when it presents itself, I oblige and go fish them. So Tuckertown is usually stained to dirty to nasty muddy, depending on the rain and what High Rock Lake is doing, which is just to its upstream. You can find decently clear water to it if we ain't had gully washers all the time. Most of the time, I'm expecting it to be stained muddy. That's just the way she is. In summertime, those lily pads are a lot of fun to fish. Even if you don't catch a bunch of fish, it's really something to see. June, we done got hot, guys. We're in the 80s now, in the air temperatures, probably in the high 70s in water temperatures. The bass are probably only going to be up shallow to feed. They ain't going to be up there for no other reason. The lake bass are beginning to move out deeper. The river bass are probably just now moving up, getting comfortable in the water columns. Sunfish are now wide open in the lakes, and the pleasure cruisers are now a pain. They are out a lot now because the kids are out of school. So I'm going to go up to Lake Randleman. For one main reason is because it's electric only on one half of it, and I'll show you that in a second. But I'm going to take my big fish stuff and just enjoy myself. A frog, spinnerbait, a big topwater, a swim bait, a square bill, and then something to flip. But, oops, excuse me. Randleman is near Greensboro, North Carolina. You can see it there. Is in the town of Randleman. But this area between the red line and the green line in the top of the map there is electric only. So we can slide a kayak in up there and not get a whole lot of pressure from ski boats and jet skis and such, and really have just an enjoyable day with not a lot of craziness on the water, and not feeling like you got to look both ways every time you try to paddle across a channel. But this lake is going to get a little bit less pressure. It's going to be a little bit more natural, not as much development, and something neat to go see to get off the beaten path. It's still within 2 hours of Charlotte. In July, it's done got hot, really hot, and fish ain't up very long in the shallows. The nearby rivers and creeks have the cooler flowing water now. The first wave of the sunfish are already done spawning on the lakes, and the pleasure cruisers are now insane. Thank you, July. Ugh, awful. I'm going to run back up there to the South Fork New River that we talked about. I'm going to throw a small topwater, a small jig or tube, a little buzz bait, and maybe even a small Senko. But hard to see in this picture here, but you know, the mountain ridge there showing the North Fork and the South Fork put together. South Fork's down there in the lower part of that picture. If you see the Glendale Springs word there, that's the area I'm going to fish. I'm going to, like I said, get away from people, get away from these lakes, all the people on them, go up there and catch smallmouth on top water. You know, even if it's only for one day, one morning, one afternoon, it's worth it, guys. Just start thinking about looking at stuff off the beaten path to get you out of the city, especially in summertime. In August, again, we are super duper hot. Bass ain't up shallow. Again, same deal with the nearby creeks and rivers having that cooler water. Second wave of sunfish are probably spawning by now, and the pleasure cruisers are still insane. I'm going to go creeking. I'm going to put my kayak in or wade around in the creeks around Charlotte because it's so muggy and hot. You're probably only going to fish for a few hours anyway. So I'm going to fish small baits, as you can see there. Popar, small frog, buzz bait, a little Texas rig, and maybe a little tiny fluke. But these are the creeks in Mecklenburg County, which is, you know, where the city of Charlotte is in. These are the creeks that I help take care of at work and help manage and hopefully keep from getting too polluted that goes to our lakes at that point. But what you want to look for when you're looking for creeks for bass fishing or fishing in general is typically the bigger systems. So what you've got here in Mecklenburg County is a green section here on the map and a purple section here on the map. And the green section is the Catawba River Basin, and the purple section is the Yadkin / PD River Basin. And that's important because the closer you get to that divide line, the smaller the bodies of water are. Now, the further you get, you know, towards the river themselves, you know, towards the lakes, the bigger the water body is going to be. So what I'm looking at is typically the furthest left side of that map, the green map, or the furthest right side of the purple map, to try to get in the biggest water as I can that are actually still flowing like creeks, because that's where your bigger largemouth and your bigger fish are going to be, simply because of space. So in my opinion, in Charlotte, the two best ones are Sugar Creek and Little Sugar Creek, down south around Pineville, around the South Carolina border. So, yeah, drive down there sometime, take a look at them. If you see a deep pool, park in a parking lot and walk down there and see what it looks like. It's really opened up a way for me to fish in the summer that I hadn't expected. September, starting to cool off. Again, I still want to try to fish moving water. The mornings are cooling down. The morning bite will last longer. The shoreline cover is holding more active spots now, and the pleasure cruisers are still a big deal. I'm going to run up to Bobby's, Upper Lake Wiley, fish for spotted bass next to laydowns, next to rocks, next to bank cover. These are the baits I'm going to take. I'm always going to have a fluke in the fall. Whopper plopper's huge. Swim jig now comes into play. Those spotted bass don't like those at all. And then I'm also going to have a Ned rig and a shallow crank ready to go. So Bobby's, quote unquote, is an access we use right there in Highway 27, where it crosses the river in the middle of the map. And you can either go north or south from there. If you go north, it's about a 1.5 mile ride until you get to the Mountain Island Lake Dam. And a pretty cool area fishing up there around that dam. Or you can go south from Bobby's and head towards I-85 down there, and possibly swing by the Whitewater Center there and the island and fish the same kind of cover with just a little bit dingier water. So a lot of fishing opportunities, a lot of spotted bass up there, pretty decently low fishing pressure, so it's good for summertime and early fall. I'm going to go to Bobby's. In October, days are getting shorter and cooler. School and activity at daybreak could last even longer. Shoreline cover is still holding active bass, especially in the creeks, and the deer hunting has now helped alleviate the pressure on the lake. A lot of guys are deer hunting now, which takes them off the lakes on Saturdays. I'm going to go back to Lake Baden, guys. I'm going to go back to the Atkins system and try to catch some bigger quality largemouth. Going to be fishing shad imitators now, though. Crankbait, chatterbait, swim jig, and whopper plopper. We're not going to be keying on bluegill. We're not going to be keying on crawfish so much. We're pushing that shad aspect. And again, we just talked about Baden. We're going to be focusing on coves and main lake areas where the shad are moving in and out, starting to think about going out deep as it gets colder and trying to intercept those bass as they come through there. But Bait's got a lot of surface area that'll hold a lot of fish. It holds a lot of bait. So you just got to put your head down and go, as is with most places in the fall. Put the trolling motor down or put the paddle down and go to work. And eventually you'll run into the fish, and then you'll have an aha moment. You'll figure out what's working and push that pattern till it dies. And hopefully it's something you enjoy fishing, but the fall can be phenomenal. November, days are now much shorter and cooler. School and activity could be on the surface or it could be out deep suspended. Points become key now, especially with rock. They hold heat a little bit better in sunny days. And again, deer hunting and the air temperature is a little bit uncomfortable in the morning and the evening. It's a lot colder. That helps alleviate fishing pressure for sure. We're going to go to Mid-Norman and fish some kind of, fall spotted bass push before they go cold, and have an opportunity to just catch a lot of fish. Because about this time, the Yadkin chain where Lake Baden is getting a lot more rain and it's staying muddy a little bit more. And I just don't enjoy fishing muddy water as much as I do clear water. So I'm going to go back to Norman, fish a crankbait, a jig, jerkbait, an Ned rig, and an Alabama rig. You can have a worm on there too, a shaky head as well. But I'm going to power fish a little bit more with my crankbait, jerkbait, and my jig. And, Mid-Norman, we're looking at the Highway 150 bridge south, pretty much. So that includes McCrary Creek, Mountain Creek, Davidson, all that area. As you can see, Lake Norman is massive, so you have plenty of areas to check out. I mean, you can spend all day in one area out of 50 you see on here. So go run Lake Norman. You'll find some spotted bass somewhere, and maybe even run into a largemouth. In December, the days are short, the days are cold, water temperatures are 50 or less. School and activity is going to be out in the middle. Typically on shad suspended over deep creek channels, main channel points. Points are still key though. If you can find some with rock, you can lay up on some fish feeding shallow. And the deer hunting and the air temperatures in general have definitely alleviated the fishing pressure. Not nearly as many fellas out there. I'm going to go to Lower Norman now because of that artificially hot water with clarity water down there where you have a couple different patterns that'll work. Spoon's going to be there as it always is in December. Ned rig too, small subtle bait. A swim bait if there's some shad moving around dying. Alabama rig for the same reason. Jerk bait for the same reason. And then I'm going to have a crankbait and a sinking fluke. Cover the whole basis in clear water to try to talk them spotted bass into feeding. Again, here you go, Lower Norman. The main river channel is there on the left side of the map, and down there at the middle, on the bottom of the map, you see the hot water discharge from the McGuire nuclear plant, and that whole right side of the picture there stays artificially warmer than the rest of the lake. So you have more opportunity to keep fishing aggressive a little bit longer into the winter. So that having that aspect of that lake really helps wintertime fishing. So this last little segment that I'm going to talk about is a universal never put them away technique that can withstand all the seasons if you change it, if you change a couple things. So we're going to talk about crankbaits first, and I'm going to talk about my favorite baits and where I'm going to fish them. So in the wintertime, again, we talked about the Shad Rap, number 5, number 7. Another one is a Bandit 200 series, and then an old Wiggle Wart. I'm going to look for sunlit riprap and main channel points. Probably going to mimic crawfish with the Bandit and the Wiggle Wart, and mimic shad with the Shad Rap just in case. So those are my 3 favorite for the winter. In the springtime, I'm going to switch to a KVD 1.5 square bill and a Lure Jensen speed trap. I'm trying to aggravate the bass. I'm trying to get shallow and knock against stumps and wood. Those are 2 phenomenal springtime crankbaits. Again, secondary points, shallow wood, shallow docks. I'm up shallow in the spring. And those crankbaits fish that column beautifully. In the summertime, we're going to slide out a little bit. So I'm going to look at the Strike King series of baits, the 3XD and the 5XD, get a little bit deeper, fish those points, main channel banks, deep docks, stuff like that. And then, you know, that H2O Express wake bait, if we're going to call it a crankbait, it's a wake bait, but it's a crankbait. I'm going to fish it shallow in the morning around riprap and shallow cover, you know, early in the morning, late in the evening to draw a topwater strike in the summer. So again, those techniques are going to be applied in the main channel banks, docks, and points, over schooling fish if they're there, and on shallow docks and wood early. In the fall, we're going to switch to a Red Eye Shad, lipless crankbait by Strike King. Going to keep that KVD 1.5 square bill back in the arsenal, keep that wake bait ready to go, and now you can switch to to a Shad Rap as well if that water starts really cooling down. And just like we talked about earlier, we're going to look at creek points and banks around maybe some surface schoolers or up around some shallow wood. But that is, you don't ever have to stop crankbait fishing 101 for all 4 seasons. Same thing with a worm. Like I said, there are guys that fish the same stuff all year long. This is one of them, one of the huge ones. In the wintertime, if I'm fishing a worm, I'm going to be fishing a finesse shaky head type worm or Ned rig, maybe even a drop shot with a finesse worm on it, out deep, out main channel, over schoolers, whatever. But it's not going to be laid up on the bank fishing in brush or docks or stuff like that. So it has to be able to be fished like that, which is why those are the particular type of worm rigs I use in the winter. Springtime, if you're fishing a worm, you can fish it any way you want as long as you can get it up in the water shallow. Weightless trick worm is phenomenal. A lot of guys fish that. A trick worm on a shaky head, light, you can pitch around cover, or even a Senko, a weightless Senko. I mean, these are phenomenal techniques for fishing worms in springtime. Again, shallow wood, stump flat, shallow dock, just anything up shallow is going to be ready to be able to have a worm thrown on it just because of the fact that all the fish in the lake up shallow in springtime. In summertime, I'm going to keep that weightless trick worm on for up shallow, first thing in the morning, shade, stuff like that, bass that are garden fry. But we're also going to keep that bigger trick worm on a shaky head for throwing offshore a little bit, or Carolina rig and an ultravibe speed worm. If I had to have one worm for a Carolina rig, it would be an ultravibe speed worm in whatever color you like, but watermelon red's hard to beat. Going to be fishing on the main channel now around banks, docks, and points, and then shallow docks and wood early in the morning with that floating worm. In the fall, the weightless Senko is still hard to beat, and then the old trick worm on the shaky head just around whatever kind of cover you're fishing. The Ned rig will pick up bites when the fishing's tough for whatever reason. Again, secondary points and creeks, and then wood cover on deep banks is real good in the fall. The third, you ain't got to put it away ever, technique is a fluke, which I'm really fond of. I fish a fluke a lot, pretty much all year long. In the wintertime, I'm going to nose hook a case salty sinking shad. It's a sinking fluke full of salt, and going to fish it real slow through clear water, or I'm going to put a tiny fluke on a little jig head and let it fall a little bit faster, a little bit more subtle, like a small bait fish around, docks, schooling fish, whatever. Marinas are a good place because usually they're dredged, so think about that too. And if you find some deep schooling fish, you can drop a fluke down to them on a jig head for sure. In spring, we ain't worried about that stuff no more. We're throwing that case fluke up shallow, twitching it, letting it fall, twitching it, letting it fall. Same thing with a tiny fluke. I'm going to keep it nose hooked. And then if you want to change it up and throw something fast, you can throw that little Berkeley drop shot minnow on a little scrounger head to just crank it back in and have a little bit more active searching presentation with a fluke. Again, where I'm going to throw it is everywhere up shallow, wood, stump flats, docks, just whatever's up there. Just cover it as best you can with it, however method you want to throw the fluke. Summertime, this is where the donkey rig is going to come into play, the double fluke rig. Those fish are schooling, they're looking up to feed. You can take that off a point and twitch it and possibly draw them up easier. I'm also going to rig a tiny fluke nose hook just to catch fish when fishing gets really tough in the dog days. Going to stay on the main channel, and early in the morning I'm going to be right up against the bank. And then I'm going to move out and look for schooling fish. So, yeah, the fluke nose hooked is great in the morning. And if you are getting on some fish in the summertime, you want to try to draw them up, that double fluke rig can be great. The fall, just the opposite though. Just like springtime, they could be anywhere along the banks. Again, that case salty stinking shad nose hooked is my number one go-to, or that tiny fluke. It's just going to put fish in the boat of all sizes all over the lake. I'm going to pull the scrounger out again. This time we're going to look at secondary points and creek docks, and then maybe some wood cover on some deep banks is good in the fall. So those three universal bait genres are only season dependent with the color, action, depth, speed, and locations that you are using. So for example, if we did winter time crankbaits, and you want to then mimic a crayfish, that's the color, the action, the depth, the speed, and the location you're going to take that crankbait that's shaped like a crayfish or colored like a crayfish. And just the opposite in the summertime, if you're trying to mimic a big shad out deep, that's going to affect the color, the action, the depth, the speed, location. So basically, if you're willing to change those 5 bullet points there, you can keep these 3 techniques rigged up all year long and figure out how to fish them all year long to keep putting fish in the boat. But there's definitely the 3 most universal styles of baits that I've ever fished. They can be fished all year long as you're willing to change how you fish them. So choosing the rig for the season, to summarize this up, if you're going to cover the column, cover it for that day or that trip, guys. Don't worry about what you did 2 months ago, what John said he did 8 months ago. Think about that day and that trip and then cover the column as best you can. Think about the water temperature for your speed and the depth of what you're going to fish. Think about the forage that you're trying to hop up on, like you really wouldn't want to look for bluegill in winter as a forage. So that will determine what you want to mimic the most based on what you're trying to attack. And then top water usually needs around 60 degrees or more. So if you're thinking about trying a top water, don't get discouraged if it ain't working because the water temperature is 52 degrees. Let it get above 60. That way you have the better opportunity for those fish to be aggressive enough to come to the surface, and then try it out. Trust me, I wait for top water every year. And then try something new for each season, guys, just to get better. Just go outside the box and try a new technique, a new bait style. If people are catching fish around you and you're not, try to ask them what they're doing and figure out if it's something that, is a technique, is it a new bait, is it a new design of a bait. But try something new each season to get better and see if you like it or if you don't. And then if you don't, you ain't never got to pick it up again. But if you do, you got a new weapon in your arsenal for going forward. Okay, I appreciate everybody listening in and humoring me for a little while as we talk about seasonality here around Charlotte, North Carolina. Um, if you have any questions or comments, you can find me in the pages there on Facebook. Bro Staff Bass Class is going to be the best one on Facebook, and on YouTube, my account's called Fergfish. And I really appreciate everybody listening to these classes. I enjoy doing them, and can't wait to get Volume 6 ready to go and put up here so you guys can enjoy that one too. So thank you for listening, and look forward to talking to you again soon.